Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amir Weiner, Director of the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies. And few topics are more important, more intriguing, and also underreported than the Russian economy, especially nowadays. And the performance of the Russian economy and the trajectory of the Russian economy under the conditions of war is indeed one of the key issues of present geopolitics. And few people are better positioned to talk about it, to explain things to us than Professor Andrei Yakovlev. For 30 years, he served and was employed in the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, the finest academic institutions in Russia, where he also was the director of the Institute of Industrial and Market Studies, and he's the winner of the Gaidar Prize in Economics in 2017. He's a long-time collaborator with many scholars here in what we call the West, in the United States, and in Germany. Most recently, he's been at Harvard University at the Davis Center, and nowadays in Bremen, in Germany. It is our pleasure to welcome you, and we're looking forward to hearing.
I'm really glad to be here. I was last time 15 years ago in Stanford. I'm really glad to be here again in this beautiful place. So, concerning my presentation, it will consist of two parts. And I will start with some description of economic situation in Russia from the point of view of Russian business, because during my academic work at HSC, I was focused mostly on the analysis of state business relations during the last 20 years. And therefore, even after leaving Russia, I could keep some contacts with representatives of business, also with some people from bureaucracy, so also with many experts. And therefore, I try to provide some kind of picture based not only on official statistics, because it is available here, but about some analysis of perceptions and attitudes of people in the real economy. And second part will be more general, with some kind of political economy view on prospects. Yeah. Okay. So now regarding overall situation in Russian economy. First of all, it's necessary to stress that previous decade it was about real stagnation. Starting from 2012, annual growth Russian economy was at 1%. And it was, in my view, one of the reasons for the expectations in the West about collapse of Russian economy and Putin regime after the start of war and after implementation of all these international sanctions. Nevertheless, it was interesting that already in 2020, during COVID-19 pandemic, Russian economy demonstrated a much better performance than it was expected at this time. Because initial forecast for 2020 was about 6% decline of GDP. In reality, it was only 2.5%. And at the same time, Russian government spent much lower amount of resources to support the economy compared to the US, to Germany, and many other countries. Nevertheless, in 2022, actually on both sides, it was not only about foreign scholars, it was also about many Russian experts, including representatives of central bank and Russian government. Very negative expectations were typical. Some kind of assessments of decline of GDP for 10 or 12%, with collapse of financial system and so on. In reality, it was not so. No, here I provided initial numbers of Росстат about 2% decline in 2022. Recent assessments of Росстат are even better. It is, I think, 1.2% decline in 2022. In 2023, we could see a new wave of assessments from international scholars with some kind of statements that, yes, in 2022, Russian economy had better performance compared to initial expectations, but later it will be stagnation for 2023, 2024, and so on. However, already in summer of 2023, international organizations like World Bank, IMF started to revise these assessments, improving it. Yeah. No, and in reality, it was quite significant economic growth by the economy in 2023, by about 2.5%. And expectations for 2024 are a bit lower, but not too much. I provided here earlier assessments of World Bank and IMF, but now they are higher. And it is the reason for the question of why Russian economy was so resistant. Now about my approach. Of course, it's clearly understandable that macroeconomic and international factors are very important for such situations. It's true. Yeah. And I will talk a bit later about some specific contradictory consequences of international sanctions and so on. But at the same time, and it is exactly, for instance, from my personal experience of 90s. Yeah, I know that some colleagues here can remember this time. For instance, in 90s, Russian economy also demonstrated very strange reactions on different measures of economic policy, in some sense contradictory to expectations of economists and political scientists, not first of all economists. Yeah. For instance, with barter economy, non-payments, and so on. Yeah. Of course, it was possible to explain it later, but in mid-90s, it was not understandable for many people. And exactly some kind of microeconomic research, we focus on a survey of top managers and owners of Russian firms, could help their reasons for such strange performance of Russian economy at this time. And more generally, in cases of very strong structural crisis, of course, macroeconomic factors matter, it's understandable. But at the same time, strategies of companies and expectations of top managers and owners of companies are matter too, and maybe even more, because exactly depending on the activity of these economic actors, we can see different trends in real economic life. No, and therefore, with all understanding of importance of quantitative methods, and again, during my work at HSC, we worked a lot with different kind of quantitative data. It was about public procurement, for instance. It was also about large formalized surveys of Russian firms. So yeah, I know all these things quite well. But at the same time, quantitative methods with in-depth interviews with owners and managers of companies can be important as source of information exactly in such time periods. Regarding myself, it's a bit specific. First of all, because of course it's biased. And totally it was 31 respondents with 44 interviews during these 2 years. It was the 3 parts of this sample. First one was about interviews with heads and owners of manufacturing companies in spring and summer 2022. And it was part of my project with a group of my colleagues. Another part was related to IT sector and IT industry. And these interviews were conducted mostly in autumn 2022. But in this case, we could repeat some of these interviews later in 2023. And third part is maybe the most specific, because it is my personal contacts. Not because in framework of my research during the last 20 years, I had a lot of personal contacts, and with some of these people I have some kind of friendly relations and so on. But main reason for these contacts were professional, because I tried, even before the war, it was not related to the war, to talk with them perhaps once a year about some kind of development in their sectors, in their regions, for better understanding of reality, no more. And at the same time, as expert in economic policy, I could provide some kind of useful things for these people, so it was some kind of exchange. And we try to continue it, yeah. Well, because, for instance, with my work at data center and also participation in other projects, these people in Russian business are also trying to understand the situation from another side. Yeah. Nevertheless, of course, it is also some kind of bias in terms of the performance of these companies. Not because even in my time in HSC in Moscow, of course, for instance, very corrupted people from Russian business. Of course, we have such people, yeah. They were not very ready to contact scholars from HSC, for instance. And of course, it is mostly about more advanced companies with higher level of productivity. And from this point of view, of course, it is maybe about a better part of Russian business. But for the purposes of this paper, yeah, because it is the paper, and I plan to submit it to Professor Takas maybe the next months. Maybe it is even good because exactly activity of such kind of firms could help to survive for Russian economy and to survive for regime. Okay. Now about sources of economic resilience. At this slide, it is mostly about 2022. Next slide will be about 2023. Of course, I could provide also some kind of citations from my interviews, but I try to save time and space here. Nevertheless, at the beginning, about exactly these important macroeconomic factors. And first one is about, I would say, very contradictory effects of international sanctions, especially 2022, but 2023 also. Because initial declarations of US government, of all these European governments, were about limitations of financial opportunities for Kremlin and for Russian government to continue the war. But in reality, as you can see here, again, it is not new, it is not my data. In 2022, Kremlin and Russian government had 100 billion more export revenue compared to 2021. And therefore, Kremlin had money not only to continue the war, but also to finance all social programs. So, for instance, I have also contacts not only with people from business, but also with people from Russian universities. Not only HSC, but also some regional universities, yeah. And maybe it was not increase in financing, but it was not any reduction of financing in 2022, 2023. Yeah. And of course, for some kind of social stability, it's important. But even more, Kremlin had enough money to finance also different kind of economic programs and provide, especially in 2022, quite significant support for the economy. We can discuss maybe after my slides, yeah, the reasons for such kind of strange outcomes. Yeah, I have some explanations. But it was also another part of the story related to effects of international sanctions in terms of access to not only equipment and technology, but also parts and components. Because yes, Russian economy was and actually is till now dependent on import supply of many things. And initial expectations related to sanctions were exactly about a collapse of many Russian industries due to absence of this supply. And in our interviews, yes, it was a big problem, especially in first months. But here I provided reference to a really very good lecture of Herbert Hugh 1 year ago in Estonia. And I would recommend it strongly. Yeah, it's available in the internet. About the reasons for it. Because if, for instance, you have a well with two doors, and one door is fully closed, but another one is open as before, of course it will be a bit costly to relocate floors, yeah, but it's possible, and it was done. And in my view, it is maybe the question about relations of US and Europe with global south, or the rest, as it's called by Herbert Hill, but it's a big issue. And in my view, this war of Russia against Ukraine and the situation of international sanctions clearly show that it is some kind of problem, because the real weight of global south in global finance, global trade is already quite important. Yeah. Okay, now moving to actually my results. Yeah. First of all, Russian economy during the last 25 plus years became market economy. And of course, especially starting from 2000s, we can see more active industrial policy, all the state corporations, state-owned enterprises, and so on. But it's necessary to understand that a total majority, I think 99 plus something percent of economic entities in Russian economy are private. And exactly the activity of such small, medium-sized and large companies, private companies, searching for solutions for their own business and searching for some kind of new niches, new suppliers and so on, helped to survive for Russian economy and for regime. Simply because market economy is much more adaptive and much more flexible. And from this point of view, this situation is really not comparable to the situation of, for instance, early 90s. Next point is a bit specific, but Russian business during the last 15 years, starting from global financial crisis of 2009, faced a really very serious crisis every 3-4 years. In global economy, it was global financial crisis, and afterwards it was pandemic. Yeah. But in Russia, it was annexation of Crimea and Donbass, with a real serious crisis for Russian economy after that, also due to this first wave of international sanctions. But additionally, it was many sectoral crises related, for instance, to all these tensions between Russia and Turkey, Russia and Ukraine before, and many other crises. So, for instance, some kind of totally not expected by Russian business embargo for Russian grain export in 2010, yeah, provided huge losses for many companies. But in general, all these events led to specific expectations in Russian business that from today to tomorrow, it's better to expect some bad things. And therefore, it's better to be prepared in terms of additional reserves, lower indebtedness in terms of bank ratings, flexible relations with employees, and so on. And important point is that, for instance, in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, such kind of approach demonstrated its success in some cases. And it was an additional reason for these firms to continue such kind of policy also in 2021 and 2022. So in some sense, we were more prepared. The next point is about economic efficiency of economic activity. Again, for a long time, we can see some kind of general attitude about Russian economy and about Russian state especially as very corrupted. On one hand it's true, but on the other hand, it's necessary to understand that especially after 2011-2012 political protests, Kremlin learned important lessons, not only in terms of suppression of political opposition, Bolotna and so on, but also in terms of pressure on bureaucracy with idea to improve performance. Because these technocrats like Kirienko and not only in Kremlin recognized that yes, formal reasons for this protest in 2011 were related to all this electoral fraud during Duma elections in 2011. Yeah. But more basic reasons were related to dissatisfaction of many Russian people, especially in large cities, with improved living conditions, with higher salaries, dissatisfaction by the quality of state, because these people started to ask about education, healthcare, infrastructure, security, and of course, due to a really very high corruption in 2000s and late 2000s, because government started already to provide some financial resources for all these purposes, but it was no real outcomes. And therefore, starting from 2013, 2014, Kremlin pushed on bureaucracy. Of course, it was not about top-level people. And for instance, if you are talking about Kovalchuk's powers or Rothenberg's power and so on, it is not about that. But if we will talk about low and middle-level bureaucracy, we could really see some improvement, even in terms of lower level of corruption. For instance, all these our studies about public procurement demonstrated these things. Yeah. And in one of my interviews, it was also interesting comment about some kind of learning by doing. Because already in 2014, especially after these international sanctions, it became clear that the Russian economy is really highly dependent on import of the different kind of stuff. And it was pressure from the Kremlin to the government to elaborate some measures. But government spent, according to this respondent, about 14 months to elaborate proper schemes of subsidized loans and so on to support these import substitution projects. Yeah. From this point of view, actually, especially experience of 2020 pandemic was important, because it was really very strong pressure not only on business but also on bureaucracy, because Kremlin asked these people in bureaucracy to keep social political stability. But people in government and economic cabinet could not do it without information from business and without understanding of better solutions. And therefore, exactly 2020 pandemic led to interesting results in terms of in-depth conversations between officials and people in business. For instance, in the form of closet chats in Telegram. And of course, people from Russian business were ready before and now to have some kind of personal communications with relevant public officials, with idea to manage their own problems, maybe in exchange for some kind of bribe, so it's Russian life. But in the spring of 2020, people in government simply didn't have time for it, for any kind of personal communications. Yeah, because we should elaborate and introduce very quickly some kind of measures to support the economy. And therefore, they created these chats with 30, 40, 50 participants. In some cases, including minister, federal minister, his deputies and owners and top managers of federal companies. In some other cases with less important sectors, yeah, it could be deputy minister, for instance, as head of this chat group. But nevertheless, even some people from Russian business would like to lobby personal interests of their companies. It was a bit difficult to do it in such a room with 40 or 50 people from their sector. Yeah. And therefore, we started to discuss really solutions for their sector. And exactly because it was pressure on bureaucrats, they responded not only in terms of comments, it will work and it will not, but also in terms of some real implementation of your policy. And why I'm talking so long about this experience of 2020, because practically the same measures were introduced in the spring of 2022, but it was done in 2 or 3 weeks, and with much broader coverage. Because, for instance, in 2020, it was not 14 months, but it was about 2 months to elaborate the schemes to support small business enterprises from service industries. Yeah. And the same schemes were introduced in the spring of 2022, already not only for small business but also for medium-sized companies, and of course not only service sector but also in many manufacturing industries. Okay, maybe last point here about some kind of personal assessment, of sanctions on the side of business. It was interesting comment in one of the interview about differences in attitude to sanctions of 2014 and 2022. Because sanctions of 2014, they were also quite important for many Russian industries, and it's necessary not to underestimate the value of the sanctions. It was quite important, but interesting point is that they were considered mostly as, in some sense, fair, because they, at personal level, were against people which were really close to Putin and which were, in most cases, personally responsible for these decisions. And if we will talk about economy, it was mostly against defensive industry, and yes, it was also with some problems with many companies, many enterprises working with some kind of equipment or technology with opportunities of dual application and so on. But people in Russian business recognize it, but yes, it was reasonable. Regarding the sanctions of 2022, again, at the level of political declarations, it was told that it is against regime, it is against Putin, but in reality it was about all Russian economy. It was some kind of total sanctions. And it is not only about technological sanctions or financial sanctions, it was also about personal sanctions. It is about hundreds of people, including the United States. And in reality, many of these people, and I would say majority of these people, didn't have any relation to real decisions about the start of war. And even more, they, at this time, in 2022, simply didn't have opportunity to provide any influence of this decision. Because, no, it is maybe a separate topic, but we could see some kind of evolution of composition of ruling coalition in Russia. And yes, Russian business was quite important part of this composition, for instance, 20 years ago, especially before US case, because of that. But after that, situation changed dramatically. And even such people like Havel or Friedman really didn't have any opportunity to make any influence on these decisions. But they were all included in this list. It is not only about Havel and Friedman, it's about many hundreds of other people. And in reality, even small and medium-sized Russian businesses faced significant problems in the spring and summer of 2022. And again, for that understanding, my sample is biased also in terms of much better attitude of with my counterparts historically to Western partners, because many of them had some kind of shareholders from Italy, from Germany, and so on. But I could see, especially in repeated interviews, a real worsening of attitude to the West, some kind of increase of anti-Western attitudes in this sample. And in my view, it is in some sense the consequence of this specific design of sanctions. Again, my explanation is that on Western side, it was also some kind of misperception, because on the Russian side, in heaven, yeah, it was some kind of perception that it will be the war for 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah. With Ukraine, after that it will be some kind of sanctions, but it will be not important. Yeah. In reality, it is long-term war for 40 years. But on Western side, it was also some kind of expectation that yet it is our full war. It's necessary to stop it. And if we will implement all possible sanctions, economy will collapse, regime will collapse, and therefore after that it will be not important. Yeah. In reality, it's again not so. And in real terms, we can see the situation that, especially personal sanctions in my view, they pushed this Russian business, this rich Russians back to Putin. Because again, majority of these people, especially if you're talking not about small businesses companies, but about large companies, even having some extra profit in 2022, 2023, yeah, they understood very clearly that they don't have future. And for instance, all these events of 2023, with this starting of process of revision of privatization, of nationalization, so it's some kind of indicator of it. But they don't have any real exit strategy. No, again, maybe it's already not the topic of my presentation, yeah, because it is about some kind of assessment of desire of sanctions, but nevertheless. Final point here. This situation with sanctions created really some kind of personal attitude at the level of business, because they started to consider this situation as some kind of professional challenge. So for instance, it was some interviews with, they were not owners, they were top managers, IT directors in some Russian big organizations. They had large teams, 70 people, 80 people working with this man during many years. They created some system for this large organization. They faced huge problems, especially in the spring and summer of 2022. And they considered it as personal challenge, because they were responsible for these people and they were responsible for this organization. Again, they didn't support the war, but they worked with these people. And again, of course, for instance, especially in the IT sector, we could see also some people which left the country. No, and it's actually a separate project, because we try to study in general the situation in IT sector. Yeah? And I used here in this paper only these interviews mostly with top managers and owners of companies which are staying in Russia. Yeah? But of course, it was a number of companies left Russia, and many Russian IT workers left Russia too. Yeah? But it's also necessary to understand that actually, in reality, only few people, ordinary Russian people, yeah, could leave the country, because it is about some sources for survival, yeah, abroad. Yeah. If you don't have a job, what you will do? But if we will talk about business, of course, people from business have money. But at the same time, they created this business during the last 20-25 years. They had teams, they had clients. And it is really their content of their life. Yeah. So, again, I'm not about some kind of ethical assessment. Yeah. Because, yes, many people, yeah, maybe could do something, yeah, especially if you're talking about people from in business and in bureaucracy. But I try to show some kind of reasons for their behavior. Okay, moving to the next slide. It is about 2023. The first point is important, and many analysts wrote about it, and also it was quite visible in interviews. It's about money spent by Kremlin and by government, especially starting from the autumn of 2022. On one hand, for defensive industry, and on the other hand, for all these payments to the families of men contracted to the army, drafted to the army, and so on. And some comments related to to this policy were about excessive revenue obtained by Kremlin, Russian government, especially in 1932, and also some arguments that with decline of this revenue, it will be decline of this production in defense industry on one hand, and also decline in incomes of all these families dependent on these payments from the government. It's true, but nevertheless, it was a really quite important factor in any case, especially if we are talking about some depressed Russian regions. Because it was a real improvement of incomes level for many companies and for many ordinary Russians in these regions. No, for better understanding, these payments to Russian soldiers is 3-4 times higher in comparison with average salaries in relevant regions. No, I'm talking now not about Moscow, I'm talking about Far East, Buryatia and so on. But there is one more interesting, unexpected consequence of this policy related to the situation in labor market on one hand and to the situation with salaries in the Russian economy. Because I would say that during at least 20 years, maybe even more, we had some specific components of informal contract between Kremlin and Russian business, especially after Yugoslavia. Because after Yugoslavia, it became clear for Russian business that it's better not to take part in any political activity not approved directly by the Kremlin. But at the same time, Kremlin was interested in some support from the business. And therefore, Kremlin on one hand promised many times that it will be no revision of privatization. And at the same time, now Kremlin really tried to create better conditions for doing business and for earning profit. And it was, for instance, about this improvement of technical conditions for doing business, starting especially after 2012, with all this national entrepreneurial initiative with idea to improve positions of Russia in doing business ranking, and it was a real improvement, because in 2011 it was 120th position, and in 2019 it was 28th position, and it is according to World Bank, it is not according to Russian government. But important component of this informal contract was about cheap labor force. And Russian trade unions were extremely weak. And this cheap labor force was the source of rent, not only for oligarchs, but for all Russian business during 20 years. Element of this contract was also about non-increasing salaries. Because, for instance, in our survey of Russian firms, already starting from late 2000s, we could see every time some kind of complaints about shortage of skilled workers and so on and so on, but without any real consequences on the side of firms. And in 2023, we could see very specific situation, because one quite large sector, it is about defense industry. No, for that understanding, it was, I think, about 1.2 million workers in this industry before the start of war. So, but in general, in Russian economy, it is, I think, 72 million of people working age. So you can see that it is not small sector, but not dominant. It is about 2% or something like that. But nevertheless, this sector, contrary to all previous experience of 20 plus years, should start to increase salaries, dramatically increase, simply because this sector got, starting from the autumn of 2022, additional orders from the government with some kind of request to increase production in this sector 3-4 times. And of course, they could ask current workers to work more, but nobody can work 16 hours or 20 hours per day. Yeah? And therefore, they should start hiring. But in the framework of this contracting of men to the army, this partial mobilization in September of 2022, and also 2 ways of immigration, especially this immigration of autumn of 2022, because in the spring of 2022, mostly some people from large cities related not to industry but to different kind of creative sectors or maybe to universities and so on migrated. But in the autumn of 2022, many ordinary workers from many middle-sized cities and small towns left to Kazakhstan, to Armenia and so on. And in this case, defensive industry simply doesn't have our option. Only with increase, the dramatic increase, 2 or even 3 times salaries in this sector. But for instance, from one of my interview, it was owner of a large logistic complex in one of regions, north part of European Russia, and he told that he should increase salaries for his workers up to 70-80 thousand rubles per month, and it was clearly some kind of complaints on his side. Yeah, he would be glad not to do it, but he didn't have other option, because in our case, if he would not increase salaries to this level, again, for that understanding, normal salaries in these regions before the war, good salaries, were about 30 to 40,000 rubles per month. So it was about double. Again, it is about concrete figures with quite sophisticated equipment. And he told not about ordinary workers, it was about engineers. Yeah. But his explanation was that if he will not do it, these workers simply will move to defensive industry enterprises in the next street. And he will stop his own business, because there are no other workers in the market, especially with needed qualification. Yeah. But and I could see such kind of explanations also in many other cases. Yeah. For instance, an average, my counterparts told that it was increased at 20-25% in average salaries. Yeah. And for instance, it is in average, but if they talk about new hires, it was about 30 plus. Yeah. But it is already not only about defensive industry with this 1.2 million workers. It is about fully civilian sectors of Russian economy with thousands of fields and with millions of workers. And for instance, according to Rostov, it was about 8% increase in real salaries, so with some kind of correction for inflation. Yeah. And if we are talking about, again, not 1 million workers, but about 70 millions of Russian working in the economy, it was, of course, a very important factor for economic dynamic. And for instance, this growth of last year, in my view, could be explained also by this increase in salaries and increase in demand in the market. And it was quite important, because these people started to ask about, for instance, new houses. And it was a really increase in consumption industry. They started to ask about different kind of consumer goods. Yeah. And it was also a specific reason for devaluation of ruble in 2023. I will talk about it later. Yeah. It was also about, for instance, very strong increase in domestic tourism. So no, in any case, it is about some kind of unexpected consequences of this push with this money, mostly luckily reallocated for defensive industry, but with some kind of unexpected consequences for overall economy due to this increase in salaries. Maybe 2 additional points here about 2023. First one about new space for small and medium-sized business. Exit of many, no, maybe I will move to the next slide because there can be some kind of explanation here. Exit of many foreign companies from Russian market in 2022 created some effects, no, and also not only exit of these companies, but also with sanctions in terms of prohibition to supply many things. Yeah. Created some effects similar to the devaluation of '98, because, no, for instance, in '99, due to devaluation of ruble, some imported goods became simply too expensive. In 2022, they became not too expensive, but it was simply absence of these goods. Yeah. But in 1999, this situation created some opportunities exactly for the domestic producers. And it was a similar story in 2022. No, and for instance, here you can see some description exactly from our interviews for one sector, and it is big company. But interesting part here is about this demand for supply from Russian producers. Here, last row. Yeah. Because, for instance, 20 years ago, this gap between a quality of products and quality of equipment produced by, for instance, European producers and Russian domestic producers was really very big. And of course, now the situation is different in different sectors. Until now, we can see some kind of big inefficient firms and so on. But average level of Russian quality of Russian production increased, and therefore, this Russian companies needed for some specific supply and faced some problems with this supply from, for instance, from Europe, started to think about some substitution. And we could substitute sometimes this supply using some options in Turkey or in China. But we could find also some solutions in the Russian market. Of course, there is another important element related to small and medium-sized business, and it is exactly about aviation of sanctions. Because for large companies, it is much more difficult to do it because we are much more visible in any transactions. But if we are talking about thousands, dozens of thousands of small and medium-sized firms, it's simply much more difficult to monitor activity of such kind of firms. And therefore, we are really employed quite actively by Russian government, sometimes by Russian firms, with the idea to avoid sanctions. Very last point here, but it's also specific. It's about increase in investment in the Russian economy in 2022 and especially 2023. There are, no, on one hand, like in this slide, yeah, you could see, it was niches in the market, and it was some kind of competition between Russian producers in this market, and therefore they tried to capture these opportunities, and they needed to really some kind of investment. It was understandable, but it was one more specific element. Many Russian firms, for decades, having some kind of extra incomes, preferred to move this extra money abroad. Not simply because it was really insecure property rights in Russia, and it was much more safer to keep at least some money abroad. After introduction of sanctions, and especially financial sanctions, it became much more difficult to move money abroad. And therefore, many Russian companies had extra profit and extra money in their accounts, bank accounts in 2022, 2023. But specificity of Russian economy during last decades was exactly in this insecurity of property rights. And especially, it was a specific story with violent pressure on Russian business, with idea to capture assets and so on. And such kind of pressure was executed by corrupted people from law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, investigators, people from police and so on. But for such kind of radar attacks, firms with cash in bank accounts were much more attractive. Because if you have some kind of material assets, buildings, equipments, and so on, in the case of capture, it's not so easy to transform all these assets in cash. It's necessary to have some kind of additional skills, additional time, and so on. But if you have money in your bank accounts, you are much more attractive. And it was additional reason to spend money, because many of my counterparts told that they try to buy at least something, not to have excessive cash in bank accounts. But it led finally to some kind of additional investment. Okay, now moving to final and second part of my presentation. So, on one hand, we have quite good economic results. I try to provide some kind of summary with extremely low unemployment rate, actually quite moderate budget deficit, and so on and so on. Even in terms of currency exchange rate, it was quite strong devaluation in summer of last year, but finally, central bank with Minister of Finance could manage the situation. Yeah. But at the same time, it looks, all this picture looks a bit artificial, because yes, on one hand, it was not only governmental demand for defensive industry, it was real demand from ordinary people, from many civilian sectors, due to this increase in salaries, not only in the defensive industry but in the economy in last year. But economies simply don't have the capacity to respond on all this demand. And the response was really in increasing import of consumer goods from China, from Turkey, and so on in the summer of last year, with quite strong impact on currency exchange rate. Yeah. Yes, finally, the central bank could manage the situation, but it was a really dramatic increase in the central bank rate from 7.5% in July till 16% in October. And it is 16% till now, without visible consequences for inflation. And for instance, it was quite interesting comment of Hugin, his former deputy minister of finance and so on. Journalists asked him about the situation, and he answered that if with such a rate of central bank, 16%, formally reported inflation is only 7%, and it's really very strange. But in reality, commercial banks should keep their rates for loans above this central bank rate. They don't have real option. But if firms in the economy can operate with such rate, it means that real inflation is higher. It's again also about some kind of incentives for bias in information provided by relevant agencies to the government in Kremlin. Okay, one more important point also, already from conversations with people, I could see some kind of change in expectations from these my repeated interviews in autumn of 2023. Because before, people, of course, they were not very optimistic, but they could survive during 2022-2023, and they had some kind of hopes. But of course, it is bad equilibrium, it is war. Yeah. But perhaps it can be some kind of new plateau, with some kind of new stability. But for instance, this draft of federal budget for 2024, with this dramatic increase of many expenses, it was a very clear indicator that it will be no stability. And also with all these criminal cases with nationalization of many assets, also was quite bad indicator. No, and we can see now also some kind of confirmation of these initial expectations about bad future with new military escalation in Ukraine. And therefore, I would provide also some kind of another dimension. Because, for instance, with understanding that it is really a long war, we can see, especially here in the US, a number of reports, Red Corporation, Atlantic Council, and so on, about future relations with Russia. No, perhaps it is, no, for instance, it is one example, from Red Corporation, Sam Charap, Cold Peace, Cold War, and so on and so on. But what is the problem with such kind of reports and such kind of visions in my view? That basically these experts assume that Putin regime is stable, and it will be stable for many years. And therefore it's necessary to think about some kind of negotiations with his regime and so on, and about different strategies of his negotiations. But what is the problem in my view? That in reality, the regime was stable before the war. It was better equilibrium, with some kind of stagnation, with growing protests at regional level and so on, because especially starting from 2018, after pension reform, we can see many protests not only in Moscow, but also in Khabarovsk, in Arkhangelsk, in Yekaterinburg, in Bashkiria, and so on. But opposition was in real terms weak, it was suppressed. And in my view, the regime could continue more or less this stage for years, maybe even for decades. Of course, it was not good, but it was more or less stable. And starting with war, Kremlin itself has broken this equilibrium. And now it is not stable situation, it is some kind of situation and model of dynamic. And here I try to provide some kind of arguments for it, because, for instance, after 2014, it was really this Crimea consensus at the level of ordinary people, with really some kind of increase in patriotic attitudes, and with support of this decision. It is not about Donbass, it is exactly about Crimea. And of course, Kremlin and elites used these patriotic attitudes, because it was a real, quite serious decline in personal incomes in 2015. It was about 10% decline. But ordinary people were ready to lose something for the interest of country. It was not about elite. It's important. But nevertheless, if you talk about elite, it was not similarly so, because quite many people, especially in business, already in 2014 started to recognize that the future is very unclear. But they started to move not very fastly, sending people abroad, moving some assets abroad, maybe closing and selling some firms and so on and so on, and maybe moving themselves abroad in 2 or 3 years. So it was not very fast process. But the majority of people in elite were more or less happy, also because they got different kind of compensations. For instance, it was Crimea Bridge for Webber hours, or it was also quite good rents for many people in the case of Russian food power, with real growth in Russian agriculture. Now it's totally not so. Both at the level of ordinary people. For instance, there are different kind of sociological surveys. For instance, you could see these reports of the Levada Center about huge support for special military operations, about 80% and so on and so on. For better understanding, I really respect people from Levada, because they try to continue to do something in Russia. It's really not easy, it's really risky for them. But at the same time, from professional point of view, I really didn't understand their explanations. So for instance, I think some of you could remember this story of 1983 with Korean Boeing collapsed due to attack of Russian Soviet Air Force. Yeah, and it was some kind of peak of tensions between Soviet Union and the West. Yeah, with Russian missiles sent by Andropov to Eastern European countries and so on. And for instance, if somebody would call to ordinary Russian citizens by phone and would ask, do you support Mr. Andropov? Do you support special military operation of Soviet army in Afghanistan? Do you trust the KGB? What kind of answers would you expect? And the problem is that, yes, argument of people from the other center is that they are asking the same questions during 20 years. I'm fine, yeah, but situation from February 22 changed dramatically, because before February 22, yeah, of course it was suppression of political opposition, but nevertheless, a number of independent mass media, like Echo Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta, could operate. They all were prohibited from March of 2022 for a post in Facebook against the war. It's possible to go to prison. Of course, not all people move to the prison, but a number of political prisoners now is already higher compared to Brezhnev time. From this point of view, I would recommend, for instance, to look at some kind of additional sources, for instance, like Chronicles project, yeah. And we try to ask, of course, we're asking also about direct questions, yeah, but we ask also about some more specific questions, like, for instance, sometimes more soft questions. For instance, if Russian government will face problems with budget incomes, and it will be necessary to make choice between financing of army and security and financing social programs. What do you prefer? And many people which supported, in the case of direct question, with special military operations, yeah, told that in the case of such kind of choice, they would prefer to finance social programs, not army and security. At the same time, there is another question. For instance, if Mr. Putin will decide to stop these special military operations without achieving conflict goals from today to tomorrow, without any additional conditions, yeah, will you support his decision or not? Again, many people which supported military operation in direct question said, yes, we will agree. And as a result, for instance, in this first case, yeah, according to these scholars from Chronicles project, yeah, a share of supporters and opponents of war, some kind of core, yeah, in real terms is similar. It's about 20%. Of course, it's also awful that 20% of Russian citizens are supporting this awful war. Yeah, with all these arguments, for instance, they would be against Putin's decision to stop this war, for instance, yeah. But nevertheless, it is not about total majority. So, no, maybe you could read already these arguments in his slides, so I will move. So, I think it's more or less understandable. So, I think it was final slide. Maybe not very optimistic. Yeah, finished now. Yeah. Contrary to, for instance, these scenarios of Semcharov, yeah, about cold peace, cold war, and so on. I'm personally, no, of course, it is already not directly based on my interviews, because people are not very ready to talk about such things. Yeah, but it is some kind of analysis already, yeah, from different sources. The problem for Putin and for regime now is that the situation now is not stable, and we should move to another model. But in my view, they try to move, in the best case, to the model of Belarus. But in real terms, it is about North Korea. With very strong ideological control for any things, and so on and so on and so on. And also, in my view, with a real weakening of different kind of market mechanisms. Yeah? And we can see it, yeah. But the problem is that, unfortunately, it is quite probable scenario, because there is no real resistance on the side of Russian population, on the side of Russian elite. Also because, on one hand, especially in the case of elites, yeah, these people see some personal risks. It was a number of cases, I think about 25 or even more, with very strange deaths of top managers of Russian private and state-owned companies, not only in Russia but also abroad. It was very clear signal for people from elite. Yeah. And of course, it is not a real political and economic crisis now, because any elite, it's not only about Russia, it's about elite in any country, will not do anything without quite strong pressure. Right? It is not the time for such kind of pressure. But we can expect that economic situation will worsen. Yeah? And it can be such situation of real pressure on elite in terms of real economic and political crisis. But the problem is that these people didn't understand real alternative. For instance, if you compare this situation with late 80s or early 90s, in terms of economic situation, late 80s or early 90s, it was time with much worse conditions. Yeah. But at the same time, it was quite clear attitude that there is some model with market economy and democracy, mostly like in Europe, not in the US. Yeah? And it was some kind of expectations that yes, it will be hard years, but after that, it will be better future. Now, not only ordinary people, but also people in elite didn't understand positive alternative to regime. Some negative alternatives like Prigozhin, yeah? It was demonstrated quite clearly. Prigozhin is dead, but this alternative is here. And for instance, with North Korea scenario, or maybe this scenario with LNR-DNR regime, yeah? It is quite visible, yeah? And we are moving. Yeah? But it is not just now, it is maybe next future. But the absence of real alternative, in my view, is quite important point. Of course, it is first of all the problem of Russian opposition, because unfortunately during last 10 plus years, it could not formulate a clear positive vision future for the country. But unfortunately, in my view, it is also, in some sense, a problem of the West, because I fully understand the situation of experts and policymakers here and in Europe, especially after the start of war, because it was necessary to respond very quickly on these powerful events. Yeah. But it is already 2 years. And unfortunately, for instance, during my year in Harvard and also during my master's in Germany, no, especially in Europe, at least people express some concerns. We are unfortunately more ready to talk about the future. Yeah. But in the US, especially 1 year ago, it was not so. There is no real strategic vision about Russia after the war. And what kind of Russia could be acceptable for the West. And it is not only about some kind of position, it is also about incentives. Because, for instance, in terms of sanctions now are only about pressure. But, for instance, I know personally a number of people from Russian business which would be happy to exit from a sanctioned list. But there is not any clear exit strategy, not any guides of what you should do if you would like to exit. So maybe I will stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, so please, Alexandra.
Thank you so much for this. I have 2 quick questions to ask. The first is, you made this comment that's building off of Fiona Hill about the door to the west is closed, the door to the east is now open. And my question for you is, what are the longer term implications for that, for the economy, the effect of turning to China primarily China, to secure many inputs and to evade sanctions, etc. I suspect that there's a pretty high cost, and I have a few thoughts on that. So one is that many of the critical imports that Russia is getting from places like China are double the cost. There's longer lead times to get those inputs. And also, as we saw with some of the Russian press reporting from, I think it was last year, that the semiconductors that Russia was getting from China, 40% of them were proving to be faulty. So my question is, what is the long-term impact for Russia's economy, and what does that mean, increasing the dependence of Russia on China? Many of us in the West now kind of view Russia as a junior role, like a junior player to China. And so what are your thoughts on that? And then just more of a comment, I guess. I agree with you about the sanctions and an exit plan or an off-ramp of what do we look for next. And my thoughts are, and I'm sure there's other people in this room who have other thoughts, it's part of seizing assets was that these assets have not been given back to, say, Ukraine, for example. These are being held so that it's a carrot. It's a carrot for the future for some of these individuals on sanction list, some of these enterprises that the money is there for when you behave as a responsible international player, so to speak. Okay, thank you.
So we will collect questions or
We'll take the one more.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. So I was fascinated by you mentioning a little bit the idea of firms not keeping a lot of cash on hand so that they don't become ripe targets for seizure. But you also mentioned in one of the previous slides that there was a renewed campaign of nationalizations. And could you tell us a little bit about that? Were there specific sectors targeted? Was it just that there was firms associated with oligarchs that maybe misbehaved? What was the logic behind that? Because it seems like a return to a much more direct way of asset seizure versus the, oh, you misbehaved or you have too much assets on hand and we'll take those.
One last.
What is the reason to believe in numbers? So when we are talking about several percent here, there, but if we are talking about election, everybody knows those numbers don't mean anything. If we are talking about, for example, number of cell phone actively users in Russia, total reported number is about 1 billion from this accumulated total number. The population is, let's say, 150 million.
you are looking for users of internet?
Cell phone, this is just an example. Cell phone, number of actively users of the cell phones,
So much?
cellular phones,
Mobile.
mobile phones.
Mobile
Mobile phones, yeah.
Yeah, so number of reported of those users, total from all companies, about 1 billion within Russia.
Yeah.
But population is 150.
Yeah.
Even population itself, there is some estimation that it is 100 millions, not 150.
Yeah.
It's extreme, but so, and when we're talking about just few percent here, it's kind of, where is that, how big is error?
Good question, yeah. Okay. So?
Could I ask a very quick question?
Very
Did you
short
see
one.
the sanctions imposed by the West haven't worked?
Sorry?
The Western sanctions, have they worked in any way?
In specific way, yeah. Okay. So, concerning two doors. First point, of course, Russian economy became much more dependent on China. Yeah. No, also according to official numbers, yeah, it's true. Interesting point is, however, what Russian policymakers and also some Russian firms understood it quite clearly. Now, for instance, it is from this conversation with one respondent from IT sector. A number of, so in 2022, it was a real increase in demand for services provided by Russian IT companies, simply because it was necessary to substitute many products supplied before by international companies and so on. In 2023, some decline in this demand was visible, but at the same time, even not government, but some big Russian companies came to these Russian IT firms with request to produce fully domestic software, for instance, for internal business processes, and it is about a really big business. Yeah. With idea that it will be not only independence from Europe and US IT firms. It will be independent also from supply from China. Again, it is a big question, is it possible or not? But it was interesting comment for this my respondent, because he told that yes, he understands the issue. And it was different perceptions of this question on this problem. Because yes, IT industry in general is global industry. Yeah? And there is a huge number of advantages to be integrated in global space. But it depended also on personal attitude. And for instance, exactly many strong Russian IT specialists integrated in global market left country. But the total number is maybe 7% or 10%, and 90% are in Russia. And not all of them are weak and not competent. Many of them are quite strong. And for them, it is a really dramatic professional challenge, and some kind of big opportunity. Because before, due to this presence of huge number of international products, they simply didn't have opportunity to do and to think about such great goals. Yeah. Again, it is not about feasibility, yeah, but it is about some kind of perception. Yeah. And coming back to your question, on one hand, you are fully right that Russian economy is dependent on China now, and in the long term, it will be better. But firstly, it's understandable also by a number of Russian actors, not only at political level, but also in business. Also, these companies from Russian business try to enter some third markets. For instance, another IT firm told that, for instance, before the war, they tried to export some of their products with many efforts spent for participation in different kind of fairs, exhibitions, and so on and so on, but without real effects. Interestingly, after the start of war, they started to get some orders from such countries like Turkey, Malaysia, and so on. And according to this respondent, it can be also some reaction on international sanctions against Russia, because companies in these countries started to recognize that it can be risky to be dependent fully on the supply of these global corporations from the West. At the same time, they don't have any illusions about China. And therefore, some kind of cooperation with third party represented by these Russian producers can be some kind of solution. Again, it is not about optimism, yeah? But reality is in some sense more pleasant. Yeah? And again, these firms are market companies searching for solutions for themselves. Yeah? And these solutions formed by these firms could provide also some kind of base for survival of regime. It's a problem. Okay, concerning carrot, yeah. It's a good question, but it is also about strategy. Now, for instance, it's possible to say, it was not said, but in my opinion, it could be better to say these things. Yeah? For instance, if somebody would exit this sanction list, yeah, it's necessary to say publicly that he or she is against the law. It's necessary to close business in Russia and to stop pay any taxes to Russian government and Kremlin and so on. And it's necessary, for instance, to make some kind of donation for maybe not Ukrainian army, but for Ukrainian society and so on. So, yeah. Of course, in this case, this person should leave Russia, because with combination of all these things, he will be simply arrested. Yeah, it's understandable. But it's possible. Why not? However, there is a question about some kind of strategic goals. Because with such approach, a number of people, and I think it's about hundreds of people, will leave Russia, and they will be in the West, but they will be not in Russia more. And for instance, if we understand that, I think it was in some of my slides, yeah, I think here, yeah. It's necessary to understand that Russia never will be in the situation of Germany of 1945. And therefore, if we agree that security can be provided, real security, not in the framework of negotiations with Putin, but only in the case of political changes in Russia. These political changes in Russia can be done only by Russian actors. And therefore, in my view, it's necessary to think about incentives for these actors to do something. So, and of course, it is not only about personal level, it is also about some kind of group level. Because if you will say about concrete person that he is great in Russia, he will be under risk. But at the same time, and I think it's necessary to make some decision, the division between some individual incentives, for instance, to exit this sanction list, and some kind of group incentives. For instance, if on the Russian side, somebody, some groups, would be ready to replace Putin from power, to stop military activity in Ukraine, to start negotiations with Ukraine about peace conversations and so on. Yeah? In this case, the US or Europe and so on would be ready to do something. Again, it's necessary to understand that it can be not one-time deal, it will be a process. For instance, these Soviet troops from Eastern Germany moved back to Soviet Union, to Russia, during 3 years. And it's necessary to understand that, for instance, in the case of these occupied Ukrainian territories, it also cannot be done in 1 week. And I'm even not talking about Crimea. I'm talking only about these territories in Donbass, Zaporozhye, and so on. So, okay, next was about nationalization. Yeah. It's, in my view, a very important issue because it is about a real revision of this informal contract between Kremlin and business. And this informal contract during 2 decades after Yugoslavia was important element of social stability. And I told already about this situation in labor market, because on one hand, yes, in 2023, it was an important factor of economic dynamic. But at the same time, it is about significantly increasing costs for business. And for instance, in 2022, 2023, the business had some profit, extra profit, to finance these expenses. But now it is already about increasing taxation level, also for business, also for other people. And it is really about changes of this contract in this part, about this informal contract. But another important element of this informal contract was exactly about non-revision of privatization results. And the specificity of this nationalization process initiated by Kremlin in last year, it started actually from foreign companies. And at the very beginning, it could be considered as some kind of response on relevant actions made, for instance, in Europe by German government, by some other governments, in relations to some assets of Rosneft, Gazprom, and so on. But already starting from Baltica case and Danone case, it was already a bit different because nothing similar, it was no on Western side. But already in few months after that, Russian General Prosecutor Office started a number of cases against owners of fully Russian companies, exactly with a revision of privatization deals of 90s. It was mostly companies related in some sense to some strategic industries, including defensive industry. But later, in the autumn, for instance, it was the case of Rolf company, owned by Sergei Petrov. He was quite prominent entrepreneur, supported in some forms Russian opposition. He moved in Austria, I think, 2017, so a long time ago. It was a number of investigations against his company in terms of some kind of complaints about taxes and so on and so on, like, for instance, in the case of Yugoslavia. But finally, it was decision in December of 2023 to nationalize this company without any questions about taxes and so on, with arguments that Petrov, in his time as member of parliament, combined his political activity in public office with his business activity. No, again, it is in my view fully artificial, but the problem is that such kind of arguments can be used against half of Russian businessmen. No, and after that it was next such kind of case with Makfa. It's noodle producer, biggest noodle producer in Russia, nationalized in February or March of this year. And of course, the total amount of this nationalized assets is, at the moment, is not so big. It is about 1 trillion rubles. And for instance, capitalization of Russian stock market in last year was about, I think, 57 trillion. So it's not a very big number. But for instance, I had in Germany, in Berlin, interesting conversations with one representative of a German business community with very broad links with our German businesses operated in Russia. And for better understanding, yes, many German firms left Russia, but much more firms, especially for middle-sized business, try to keep their assets and try to wait for some kind of solution. Yeah? And during approximately 1.5 years, in 2022, 2023, they could work without problems. After that, it was the case of Heidelberg Cement in August of 2023, exactly with the idea to nationalize assets of his company. They could manage this problem, and it was one of the cases closed by General Prosecutor Office without nationalization. But especially during last months, owners of many German companies are having till now some assets in Russia started to get some informal requests to sell their assets at 3-4 times lower prices compared to the market, with very simple arguments. You can see the reality. Now you still can sell your business to us, but in 1 or 2 months or 3 months, it will be simply captured without any money. And interesting point is that, for instance, all these deals with selling of assets of large foreign companies in Russia before, on the Russian side, were conducted maybe not by first level people from Russian business, but maybe second level, third level. Now it is about totally unknown people without any reputation. And in my view, it is about, it is very in line with this point of Putin, that he needs for new elite. And for instance, these people which enriched themselves in 90s, they are not elite. And it will be new elite with people coming from the front. And it's necessary to provide some assets. Of course, it is not about real people from the front. It's about some people from some kind of neighborhoods, of people in security services, in army and so on. And people, Putin is really dependent, especially on the people from army. And it's necessary for him to provide some kind of friends for his people. So it is really about some kind of reconfiguration of Russian elite. And of course, people in large business are trying to manage this issue with some kind of personal contacts. But there are differences, because, for instance, such people like Rottenberg brothers or Kovalchuk or Timchenko and so on, they have very close personal access to Putin. Yeah? Maybe without real influence on his political decisions, but nevertheless. But such people like Mordashov or Potanin or Friedman and others, they are all oligarchs. And therefore, I personally would expect some kind of redistribution of assets of exactly these people to the hands of some new people which are fully dependent on Putin. With idea to create some kind of new elite, more consolidated, and again fully dependent on Putin. It is, in my view, some kind of interpretation of this process of consolidation.
We'll have to stop here and informally we can continue our discussion because people have to go to classes here. So thank you so much.